Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russia Through Propaganda. Today's day 58, and finally we're learning numbers. So why did we wait so long? Well, first of all, I think we had our hands full in book one. I'm sure you'll agree with me that we packed about as much as we could into that book. But the main reason is that in order to really use numbers in Russian, we need to know genitive case forms, both singular and plural. So this is actually a pretty tricky topic, and it's one we won't really deal with completely until book four, believe it or not. So there'll be a bit more to add, but we're going to learn the basics here in book two, starting today with simply learning the forms of the numbers, which is basically for counting. And then next chapter, when we add the genitive plural, we'll be able to combine numbers with nouns, like 3 books, 4 books, 5 books, and so forth. And again, we'll see that in Russian, that combination will usually require the noun to appear in the genitive, either the genitive singular or the genitive plural. So more on that later. Today we're going to keep it simple and just learn the numbers, essentially. The cardinal numbers, right? So 2, 3, 4. Later we'll learn the ordinals, right? First, second, third, fourth, etc. So let's start with the poster. If you've studied any Soviet history at all, you've probably heard the term, the 5-year plans they had, as part of the planned economy. And in Russian, the word for the 5-year plan it's one word, no hyphens, pятилетка. A pятилетка, that's a feminine noun formed out of the number 5, and then a little noun based on the form let, which we haven't seen yet. That's an irregular genitive plural of the word god, meaning year, right? So it's a little bit of a complicated word there, but basically it means something like something that lasts for 5 years, right? A pятилетка, a 5-year plan in English. And the poster here says that pятилетку, by the way, that goes back to a recent lesson when we talked about word order, right? If we've just learned that the word for 5-year plan is pятилетка, it's a feminine noun. And we start reading this poster, and the first thing we see is pятилетку. Okay, and again, the temptation, ask yourself how you process that, right? Did you start thinking, or did you assume that, okay, the 5-year plan is going to blah, blah, blah? Did you read that as a subject? Okay, if you did, then again, it's an indicator of how stubborn these expectations with regard to word order are that we bring from English, right? In theory, if you've just learned that pятилетка is a feminine noun, and you see the first word in this sentence, pятилетку, that should register as accusative, right? Clearly accusative. And again, the only way you know that, the only way a Russian would know that, is by looking at the case ending. But again, the tendency for students is to just kind of ignore the case ending, or think maybe it doesn't really matter, and I'll just kind of, make my way through it as best I can, right? But we need to be really careful about looking at the case endings. Pятилетку, that's our direct object, accusative. Okay, so pятилетку, something is going to be done to the 5-year plan. Okay, next we see в 4 года. That means in 4 years, within 4 years, and there's a preview of what we'll learn later. God there is in the genitive singular, right? So the numbers 2, 3, 4 are followed by the genitive singular, right? 4 года. And then finally we get the verb выполним, right? Which also contains our subject, we will fulfill, a perfective verb. So we can now kind of untangle it in good English word order and putting the subject first as we usually would, and say, we will fulfill the 5-year plan in 4 years, within 4 years. Why? Because we have to not only выполнить the plan, but we have to перевыполнить, which means to over-fulfill the plan, right? So if we want to be a good shock worker, and by the way, this also goes for your Russian studies, your homework, your worksheets, you don't want to simply just fulfill the plan. You want to over-fulfill the plan, right? You want to over-fulfill the quota. That's how you can become a true udarnik, right? A true shock worker like this guy. Okay, so let's learn the numbers, right? And I've tried to arrange this as conveniently as I can, and it looks rather daunting, but as is usually the case when you're learning numbers in a language, it's usually not as bad as it looks at first glance. Okay, so let's start with the singles, right? And just read these out as if we were counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, now you may note one little oddity. There's a separate form for dva, which is dvie, and that's used with feminine nouns. So we're going to talk more about that later. I'm not sure we'll get into it today. but basically you would use dva kind of as your default, and also as when you're just counting, for example, or when you've got it when you're referring to a masculine or a neuter noun, the dvia form is used specifically with feminine nouns. Okay, so a little thing there. Okay, you may have been wondering, right? We just learned this word pitiliatka, and you see that the form there that was used to make that word isn't piat, but piti. Piti is the genitive form of the number piat, right? Which is often used when you're creating compound words out of numbers. So I mentioned that simply to note that, in case you're wondering, these numbers do all decline, right? Meaning they have a full set of case forms that we're going to learn later. That's one of the major topics I mentioned before that we're going to save until book 4, I believe. So you may see some various case forms of these here and there. Now I can quickly kind of preview that. Dva, три, четыре. Well, first of all, один is basically a special modifier. It's an adjective. Dva, три, четыре, or we can think of them as irregular nouns. They're going to have weird case forms that we're going to, again, learn in book 4. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? Note sorry, 5. I'm not sure if I said 5. Right, 5 through 10, you may note they all end in a soft sign. So you're probably wondering, well, are those masculine nouns or e-nouns? Well, I'll tell you they're e-nouns, right? So all these numbers ending in a soft sign they're going to decline like feminine e-nouns, right? Which is another reason why I saved the numbers for right this point, after we know basically what an e-noun is. Okay, so there are the singles. Let's look at the teens, and we can see what's going on here. Again, it's pretty easy. We get the single, like один, for 11, right? We say literally 1 on to 10 is the idea, right? 1 on to 10. And you see this little suffix, nadsits, is a contracted form of na diesits, right? On to 10, right? So we're adding 1 to 10, we get 11. Okay, so these forms are pretty easy. Now look, as we're reading through here, note that by the way, this is a very common spelling mistake. And the rule of thumb here, this can be really helpful actually, is to remember that in these compound numbers, you, as a rule, only have one soft sign, right? So we'll see this again in a moment, right? But for these teens, the only soft sign in this compound number appears at the end. The soft sign that was originally in the single version of the number, right? 1, 5, 6, 7, etc., disappears, right? So look over that spelling really carefully and note that I'm checking it here. There are no typos there, so that's exactly as it should be. But again, we're losing that initial soft sign when we create a compound number. Okay, so let's read through these. 11, note the two N's there, by the way, another common mistake. 11, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Okay, so soft signs at the end. Okay, now compare those to the tens, right? 10, 20, 30, etc. Okay, let's just go through these. 10, okay, we learned that already. 20 and 30, okay, so those kind of form a pair, right? 20 and 30 are a little bit kind of doing their own thing. Again, they're going to be e-nouns. The word 40 is really weird. Sork, right? It's kind of the odd man out here. There's a bizarre etymology behind that. You can look it up if you want, but I'm not sure it's worth getting into here. But you can tell that it's something very unusual is going on there. Okay, anyway, look at 50, 60, 70, 80. Yeah, those 4. And we see that here, again, this is a compound number, but here the soft sign is kept on the singles digit. It disappears from the 10 portion at the end, right? So we're looking at something like 5 tens, 6 tens, right? 50, 60, 70, etc. And again, this is where that little rule comes in that we only have one soft sign in these compound words. And in the tens, the soft sign, if any, again, well, for 50, 60, 70, and 80, is in the middle of the word, right? Not at the end. Okay, I think the best way to remember this, again, you can see it's quite confusing, is to really try to hear that the hardness of the T at the end of these numbers, right? Hopefully by now you can hear that pretty clearly. So for example, 50 is not piat, desiat. I'm trying to say that very clearly, but rather pidisiat, right? Hard T. So t, not t, at the end of that word. Pidisiat, 60, 70, 80. Okay, yeah, and then 90. Okay, so I'll read through the tens one more time. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. Okay, what about compounds, right? So like 21, 22, or it could be 31, 32, anything like that. Pretty simple in Russian. You just get the tens component and then followed by the single, right? So very easy. No hyphen, by the way. 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. And then we would be to 30, 31, 32, right? 33, etc. Okay, so if we look at the hundreds, right, the word for hundred is sto, right? And we can see that there with 100. That's simply sto. It's a neuter noun. Uh, Now, the 200, we're basically saying 200s, more or less. 200, that's a bit irregular. Now, look at 300 and 400. We see that, as we mentioned, the numbers 2, 3, 4 are typically followed in Russian by the genitive singular. And that's what we see here quite regularly in 300 and 400. 300, 400, right? The number followed by sta, which is the genitive singular of sto. Now, for 5 and above, we expect those numbers to be followed by genitive plurals. And we haven't studied that yet, but here's a little preview. Genitive plurals of most hard neuters and feminines are going to take a zero ending. So basically no ending whatsoever. And often that will cause a mobile vowel to appear between two final consonants. So here we're basically getting rid of the or. We're left with sta, right? Just st. And then we have an or coming in, the mobile vowel, to sort of plug that, fill that in. Okay, so at any rate, we're left with 500, 600, 700, 800, 900. And again, the little rule of thumb applies here that we only have one soft sign in these compound numbers. Here we are keeping it after the 5, 6, 7, etc. But again, there's no reason for a soft sign to appear after sort because that's clearly a hard ta. Okay, and finally the thousands. Again, we're here just kind of dealing with a noun tысяча, which means 1,000, 1,000, right? We can see it's a feminine noun. And again, here's a little preview of how we're going to combine numbers with nouns, right? We get 2, 3, 4, тысячи, which we know is the genitive singular, right? So genitive singular after 2, 3, 4. And then 5 and above, we're getting genitive plural. Here again, that's for this feminine noun, that's looking like a zero ending. So we're basically just getting rid of the I ending completely. We have no ending left, and we get 5000, 6000, etc. So let's read through these one more time. 1000, 2000, 3000, 4000, and now switching to genitive plural, 5000, 6000, 7000, 8000, 9000, and 10,000, 10,000, and we'll stop there. Okay, so let's practice just creating some compound numbers. So this is not too difficult, really, in Russian. Refer to the table as needed, right? But let's look, for example, at a simple one, 33. That'll be 33. Very simple, no hyphen. Let's add 100 into the mix. 267, 267. Very simple. We're just kind of mechanically adding the numbers together, right? There's really nothing, there's no real grammar involved here. 2,675, 2000, right? 2,000, 600, 600, 70, 75. 2675. Okay, so let's do a few of these. Again, refer to the table and pause the video if you want to quiz yourself. 42, 42. And again, we're going to use that form dva by default if we're just simply counting or whatever. Right, remember, dvie, we'll save that for, if we're referring to something feminine. 54, 54. 66, 66. 91, 90. I'm not sure I mentioned that form 90, 90 is obviously a bit weird. 91, 91. By the way, you might want to circle in your book the numbers. Well, let's go ahead and say 9, and then 19 and 90 are very easy to confuse. As are the numbers 12 and 20. I caught myself the other day. I don't remember what I was even doing. I think I was translating Gogol or something. I was making a reader, and I translated 20 as 12. So sometimes you get lazy. It's very easy to just to misread those numbers. Okay, so you might want to circle those. And I remember back when I was in Russian 101 or whatever, I kept confusing 19 and 90 constantly, as a lot of students do. Okay, anyway, so 91 would be 91, 771, 777, 1834, 1000, right? 1000, 800, right? 800, 30, 30, 4, 2006, 2000. Okay, and again, you might analyze that a bit, right? Since we're using tысяча is our noun, and we have two of them. The noun is feminine, so we are using две there. You might want to circle that in your book. 2006. And finally, 9,999. 9000. Right, there's the zero ending, genitive plural. 9000, 999. Okay, so keep practicing those and refer to the table as you need to, but hopefully in time you'll get the hang of it. I didn't have to refer to the table when I was doing the exercise, just so you know, right? You will get the hang of it eventually. Have to practice it a lot. Okay, so let's just do a few other little silly things with numbers. How do we read addresses in Russian? Well, here are a couple of typical addresses with the typical abbreviations. In Russian, you get the street first, then the house number and the apartment number or whatever, right? So typical addresses, here are some various Pushkin-related museums. Nabережная реки Moiki. You may remember this word nabережная, that's an embankment, right? So the embankment of the river Moika. The Moika, most people would think of it as a canal. It's a little canal, but originally it was a river that's been kind of channeled into a canal. And this is the Pushkin Apartment Museum in Moscow, where he died. Actually, he was taken there after his duel, and he lay there on a sofa, which you can see, and it took him a couple of days to die very painfully with this gunshot wound from his duel. And that house was kind of a big purchase, but I guess he was renting it, come to think of it, but whatever, it doesn't matter. He only lived there, I think, a few months even. It was a very short period, maybe a year. I don't remember exactly, but he really didn't live there very long. But now if you go to Petersburg, that's kind of the main Pushkin Museum. You can see his study, his library, and his desk and all of that stuff. So it's definitely something you want to see if you're at all interested in Russian literature. Okay, let's switch gears to Moscow now. Anyway, back to that D stands for dom, right? Building, dom, 12, right? House or building number 12. Another example, улица Arbat, right? With the contraction for улица and house number, right? Dom 53, right? House number 53. Or let's add an apartment number, улица Причистенька, Dom 12, Kvartira 2, right? Apartment number 2. Now there, by the way, Kvartira is feminine, but we're basically just kind of counting. We're just giving the number. We're not really combining it with the noun to say, for example, 2 apartments. So even here we do use simply 2. Okay, zip codes. Let's see. I mean, this is just kind of practice reading numbers, really. So you could break it up. There are different ways. That's one issue, when you're studying languages. How would most speakers break up the number? The easy way, I think, for students that will, of course, always work is to simply call out digit by digit, right? That's kind of the foolproof method, right? So in that case, we would get 1, 9, 1, 8, 6, right? So no shame in that if you want to keep it simple. Or you could break it up into 3 double-digit numbers like 19, 11, 86. That would give 19, 11, 86. Now, if you have several zeros in the middle, right, that's another kind of issue. The word for zero is nol, uh, and you can say things like three, right, the first three, obviously, and then three zeros, three нуля, right? So three zeros, 21. Or, here, the last one, 19190000, right? You could say 19, right? And then 4 нуля. Okay, so now let's look at a full address, and we see that, again, for the most part, Russian addresses are the exact opposite of what we'd expect in the U.S. You get country first, then the zip, then the city, then the street, then the house number, right? So there's just an example there. Okay, yes, I'm not sure how fun it is to read out these addresses, right? Here's the address of the Ruski Muzey. Okay, let's read out these zip codes, and let's break them down by two-digit numbers if that's appropriate, right? So 19, that would be 19, 11, 11, and then 86, 86, and that's the one we did up earlier. St. Petersburg, that's the город, of course. Улица Инженерная, дом 4. Okay, here's the address of the Mariinsky Theater, at least the old one. Right now there are 3 different theater buildings that belong to the Mariinsky family, I guess, in Petersburg. There's another one in Vladivostok, I believe. Okay, let's see. So, again, we did this example already. 19:4, right, would be one way to say that. Санкт-Петербург, Театральная площадь, дом 1. What about the музей-квартира Pushkina? Okay, we saw that already, right? Its zip code would be same as, again, a Petersburg zip code here. 19:11:86, Санкт-Петербурg. By the way, sometimes you may see a little g. Well, as in the final example, right? That would stand, of course, for город, right? So город Санкт-Петербург, набережная реки Мойки, right? And then we see the abbreviation NAB for набережная, an embankment, right? Набережная реки Мойки, дом 12. And finally, the музей дачи Pushkina. So here's the example with the 3 zeros. 3 нуля, 21, город Pushkin, right? City, formerly Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsar's village that was renamed in Pushkin's honor, even though people still often call it Tsarskoye Selo, right, as sort of a tourist destination with all these palaces, but the official name is Pushkin. Улица Pushkinskaya, Dom 2/19. So if you see a little slash here, that's read as drob, at least with addresses like this. You may see that from time to time. So anyway. Okay, what about telephone numbers? Again, how are those broken up in Russian? Typically 3 parts. So let's take a typical example here. 6257842. Okay, so you see how it's split up there with a hyphen, and you just read out the parts in between the hyphens, right? So for example, 625, 625, 78, 42. Okay, so that's how it would be typically read out. Again, that can be a little bit confusing sometimes if, say, the hyphens aren't there for you. Again, if you want to be careful as a student, just simply read out digit by digit, and that will avoid any confusion. Okay, what about a full number starting with the country code? That would be, for example, 8 plus 7 also works for Russia. I'm not sure I've ever figured out why that is exactly, and it's the kind of thing I just don't really care very much about, honestly. I've never really cared much for trivia of that kind, and I'm sure I've been told 20 times and I forgot 20 times. Okay, but so anyway, that's the country code is called the Kod Strany. And of course, if you were in Russia dialing the US, you'd want to know that your Kod Strany, right, which for the US and Canada is 1. I believe that also applies to Canada. And of course, if you were from some other country, you'd want to, of course, learn your Kod Strany, right, your country code. You'd start out with that. And then, of course, your area code, which in Russian is called the kod goroda, right, the city code, and then your local number, right? So if you read that out, again, we're just separating it, treating each unit within the hyphen as a unit and reading it out like an ordinary number. For example, 8, 495, 620, 70, 42. Okay, so let's read out some numbers here. Here's a typical Moscow number with the two city codes there. 495, let's take that one. 8, 495, 538, 23, 57. Here's the typical Petersburg number, city code 812. 8, 812, 849, 28, 49. Okay, so you might practice writing out your number, complete with city code, country code and area code maybe if you want, and practice reading it out in the Russian way. Okay, let's introduce quickly, we've mentioned this a bit already, let's just do a soft introduction to nouns after numbers. I think one of the main things to remember is that you should resist, at least for a few more lessons, saying things like, again, I have 2 brothers, I have 5 brothers, and things like that. We're going to have to learn those forms later. But let's preview what goes on here with just a few simple expressions that are just very useful, right? Year and a time and then a degree if we want to tell the temperature. Right, so if we follow these nouns, we can look at them god, ras, gradus. They're all masculine, which makes this a little bit simpler for now. Right now, let's look back, back up a bit here. The forms of one are один, одна, одно. And we can see now that is acting as a special modifier. We can see how it changes its case form to reflect the gender of the noun it's referring to. One, as we might expect, actually, is followed by the nominative singular. So, for example, if I have one computer, that's going to be один компьютер. If I have one book, that's going to be одна книга, and so forth. Okay, that makes perfect sense. The others, not so much, right? Now, of course, we know that the genitive is often used with quantities, which may help you explain why the genitive. Okay, at any rate, 2, 3, 4, those numbers are followed by the genitive singular. Okay, so for example, 2, 2, 3, or 4, and then that would be followed by a noun in the genitive singular. Now, there's more to say about this. Historically, this reaches back to older forms, which were with 2, you had dual forms. So anyway, we could talk all day about this, but for now, let's just take this as a given, right? 2, 3, 4, followed by genitive singular. 5 and above, followed by genitive plural. Okay, so 5, 6, 7, etc., followed by the genitive plural. Okay, so let's look at this just with 3 simple examples. So 1 year would be один год. 2, 3, or 4 years would be два года, 3 года, 4 года, right? Genitive singular. 5, 6, 7, etc., 5 and above would be followed by the genitive plural, which for this word is just irregular, as you can tell. It literally means summers, by the way. This is actually the genitive plural of лето. Okay, so for example, 5 years would be 5 лет. Okay, let's take another really common word, раз, which means the time you do something, right? So not time like tick tock, but I did this once or twice or 3 times or whatever. That's раз. Okay, so 1 time would be один раз, 2 times, два раза, 3 раза, 4 раза, 5 times would be 5 раз. Okay, that's also a bit of an irregularity. Historically, the genitive plural, for masculine nouns at least, looked like the nominative singular. Okay, so that's very weird. But you do see vestiges of that in just for a very few masculine nouns in Russian up to this very day, right? So this is one example of that. You would expect it to be razov, I suppose, but it's not. It's ras is the genitive plural. Okay, so for example, 5 times would be 5 раз. Okay, and the word for degree is gradus. So 1 degree, один градус, 2 degrees, 2 градуса, and 5 degrees, 5 градусов. And there you see what is actually the typical genitive plural ending for hard masculine nouns. Okay, so again, that's a bit of a preview. Today we're just going to practice using these 3 nouns Now, what happens if we have a compound number? In that case, the form of the noun used after the number is determined by the final component of that number, right? So let's look at, for example, 20 years, 20. Well, that falls into the 5 and above category, right? That final, we have only here one element, right? 20, that's followed by the genitive plural, 20 лет. Okay, but 21 years, and this is the one, you might want to circle this. This is, it sort of defies all logic. We say 21 year. Okay, and again, the reason for that is that the case form год, nominative singular, is determined by that final component один, right? So 21 years, what we're saying literally 21 год. Or for example, 21 books would be 21 книга. Okay, you might want to circle that. Okay, what about 23 years? Okay, 23, we're going by 3, which calls for the genitive singular, and so we say 23 года, not 23 лет, right, for example. Okay, and finally, 26. Okay, now the second component, the final component, 6, itself calls for genitive plural, so we say 26 лет. Okay, so a lot to get used to here, and we'll treat this in more detail later. Okay, let's just give out a few of these, and again, watch the form of the noun we're using. 9 times would be 9 раз, right? That's technically genitive plural. 4 times 4 раза, that's genitive singular. 25 times 25 раз, right? Genitive plural because of 5. 21 times 21 раз, that's nominative singular. Okay, 10 years, 10 лет, right, genitive plural. 32 years, 32 года, right, genitive singular because of the 2. 35 years, 35 лет, right, because of the 5, right, genitive plural. And 13 years, 13 лет, right, that's the 5 and above category, genitive plural. Okay, what about degrees? 72 degrees, 72 градуса, right? 2 degrees, genitive singular. 72 градуса. 8 degrees, 8 градусов. 81 degrees, 81 градус, right? Nominative singular. And 40 degrees, 40 градусов. That would be, of course, the 5 and above category. Okay, how do you tell age in Russian? This is a pretty simple little idiom. It makes pretty good sense. You say something like, to me is or are 5 years, for example, right? And here, because this is usually, at least in today's lesson, in the present tense, we simply drop, we have no linking verb, right? The verb is understood as usual in Russian, right? So we say things like, нашему ребенку 1 год, to our child is 1 year, right? Or our child is 1 year old. Now, of course, we could substitute that noun, right, the dative form with the pronoun. Ему 1 год. To him is 1 year. Моей сестре 25 лет. Right, to my sister are 25 years. Or with the pronoun ей 25 лет. Мне 31 год. Right, to me are 31 years. To you are 32 years. Тебе 32 года. 32 года. Okay, and there are the dative pronouns if you need to review those. Okay, so these examples here all answer the question, сколько тебе лет? How many of years to you, right, is the genitive, the literal translation, with the genitive plural being used after сколько, right, which is also a quantity word, you may recall. I think we've had that, right, how much of whatever, how many of years, how many years are to you? Okay, so let's ask that question of these people, right, given the pronoun, and let's state the answer. Okay, so let's say, how old is he? How many years does he have? Сколько ему лет? The answer, ему 23. Now, of course, you could throw in the noun, although it's kind of superfluous. In that case, you would say 23 года. Okay, сколько ей лет? How old is she? Ей 55. 55 лет. Number 3, how old are they? Сколько им лет? Им 21. Or the full version, им 21 год. 21 год. Okay, number 4, how old are we? Сколько нам лет? Let's say we are 3. I guess we're at a nursery school or something. Нам 3 года. Нам 3 года. Okay, number 5, how old are you guys? Вы. Or again, this could be polite, speaking to one person. Сколько вам лет? And again, let's pretend it's you plural. And it's, well, we could say вам 24, right? Or we could, as if answering the question, we could say we are 24. Нам 24 года. Нам 24. Or if this question were asked politely to one person, of course, you'd say мне. Мне 24 года. Okay, number 6, how old are you? Сколько тебе лет? Мне 36, right? To me are 36 years. 26 лет. 7, how old am I? I have to ask myself that question sometimes. I forget. I honestly do. I forget how old I am. Sometimes I have to ask myself very simple questions like that, just to keep myself grounded. Okay, so anyway, how old am I? Сколько мне лет? Мне 20 лет, right? Мне 20 лет. Okay, 8, how old is she? Сколько ей лет? Let's say she's 1 year old. Ей 1 год. 1 год. Okay, there with the 1 year, you'd usually throw in the год. I suppose it would be a bit weird to say ей 1 год would be more typical. Okay, let's look at temperatures, right? Again, we learned this word grados already, so in theory, we already know basically how to tell temperatures. So you could say, for example, ask the question, сколько сегодня градусов, right? How many of degrees today, right? How many degrees do we have today? Typical answers, 21 градус, 22 градуса, 10 градусов. And for above 0 or below 0, you use something a bit peculiar in Russian. You say of warmth, namely of тепло in the genitive, which gives тепла, right? So 21 degrees above 0 would be 21 градусов тепла, right? How many degrees of warmth versus, in the final example, how many degrees of frost? Mороз means frost or freezing temperatures. So you could say, for example, 10 градусов мороза, that would mean 10 degrees below 0. Now, of course, Russians use Celsius, of course. But if you had to specify, you could say по Celsiu or по Fahrenheit, right, if you're quoting some temperature in Fahrenheit. And if you're like me, by the way, you will never really get used to Celsius. I think, I wonder, I suspect people who grew up with Celsius, it's the same way, right? It seems like the no matter how long you live somewhere, the meaning of those numbers never really sinks in. It's rather odd. Anyway, so if that's you, those are the conversion formulas I threw in there, right? If you want to convert back and forth, I guess nowadays you could ask Siri to do that for you. Okay, so for example, сегодня 5 градусов по Цельсию, right? Today it is 5 degrees in accordance with Celsius. It's sort of that use of по plus the dative. Okay, so let's give a few average monthly temperatures for St. Petersburg just for fun. Средний максимум в январе, right, so the average high, the average maximum in January. Средний максимум в январе would be, okay, so we kind of ignore the minus, although you could say -3, but let's do it the way we have in the book. 3 градуса мороза, right? And again, we don't need to say под Celsius, right? No, Russians would never say that, of course, they just assume Celsius, of course. So we could say 3 градуса мороза, or again, we could say -3. Okay, number 2, средний минимум в январе, right? The average minimum, the average low in January is, again, -8 or 8 градусов мороза. Okay, средний максимум в июле, the average high in July, 23 градуса тепла, right, 23. And the average low in July, средний минимум в июле, would be 15 градусов. By the way, those numbers for summer can be a bit deceiving. Summer weather in Petersburg is really fickle. I always warn students if you're going there in summer, uh, you definitely want to bring a jacket because it can really fluctuate. Okay, so that does it for today. Until next time, до свидания, товарищи, and вперед к новым победам.